we'll start. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the City Talks public lecture series here at the Legacy Gallery. My name is Nilesh Bose, and I teach history here at the University of Victoria, and I'm also the Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History. City Talks is organized by the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, and the conveners of this series have been Ruben Rose Redwood here of the Department of Geography, and my colleague in history, Jordan Stenger-Ross, at the Department of History at the University of Victoria, and I am the co-organizer for this term in fall of 2016. I'd like to begin first by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, and we are grateful to be here tonight. I would also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Faculty of Social Sciences, the EU Centre for Excellence, the Department of Geography, and the Department of History. The theme of the City Talk series this fall is Imperial Legacies in the Contemporary City, and tonight's lecture will feature Dr. Smriti Srinivas, joining us from the University of California, Davis, who will discuss urban designs and utopia in the context of South Asia. This is the third and final talk for fall 2016, which follows a panel discussion about the Bengal Lounge, which we held back in September, as well as a presentation by Dr. Farhad Hanam, an anthropologist from Swarthmore College, who spoke about space, class, and taste in urban in Cairo. And then in the spring of 2017, the next theme of the series will be anarchism in the city. Also, I'd just like to mention that tonight's presentation is the second lecture in the newly implemented Global South Colloquium, a forum for regular interdisciplinary exchange and intellectual exploration among faculty, graduate students, and all members of the UVic community on the history and politics of globalization. The colloquium focuses its attention on the, quote, global South, traditionally referring to parts of the world whose states have emerged out of the embers of European empires in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. But more than a geographical orientation to the, quote, non-West, this colloquium poses the global South as a question to think not only about the post-colonial world's histories, cultures, and politics, but as a provocation to orient discussions about the world system, its contours, and its inequities, including a focus not divided only by geography and nation states, but defined by placement within global histories and practices. And each year of this series will revolve around a crucial theme in the history of globalization, including topics like religion, cultural and artistic exchange, and global ecological change. This year's theme is religion and globalization, and every visitor will also have a follow-up seminar the next day, and we will have such a seminar with Dr. Srinivas in Sedgwick C168 at the University of Victoria campus at 10:30 a.m. Just a little bit about the rest of the series. In spring of 2017, we are hosting Professor Sam Moyne on January 26th, who will speak on critical histories of human rights. And on February 9th, Dr. Mayanti Fernando from University of California, Santa Cruz, who will speak about Islam in contemporary France. And finally, on March 23rd, Professor Susanna Heschel, who will speak about Judaism and Orientalism in the 19th century. And before we start the lecture today, I'd like to thank also various individuals and units for making this colloquium, the Global South Colloquium, possible. The Department of History and its chair, John Lutz, the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives, the director, Andrew Martin, the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education, the Department of Anthropology, the Center for Global Studies, and the Cultural, Social, and Political Thought Program. I'd also like to thank the students who are part of the seminar, Joel Legassi, Vikram Gill, Marta Vashovsky, Joanna Cordero, Caitlin Finley, and Adam Kostridge. So now, it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Srinivas, a professor of anthropology and a director of the Middle East and South Asian Studies program at the University of California, Davis. She's also a co-director of the Reimagining Indian Ocean Worlds Mellon Research Initiative at UC Davis. Dr. Srinivas works on South Asia and Indian Ocean worlds, on religion, on cities and urbanism, and on utopias. She's the author of several books, including Landscapes of Urban Memory, The Sacred and the Civic in India's High-Tech City, In Presence of Sai Baba, Body, City, and Memory in a Global Religious Movement, and then her most recent work, A Place for Utopia, Urban Designs from South Asia. Her talk tonight is titled The Garden and the City, Urban Designs, Theosophy, and South Asia. Please welcome Professor Srinivas.
Thank you for coming out here tonight. I must say, this is, as I was saying to Nilesh, this is such a civilized process. Have dinner and then go hear a talk. I wish we had something like this in Davis, which is much, much smaller. But I'm very glad to be here also because this is my first visit to this part of Canada. And I sent off this abstract long before I knew anything about Victoria. And so the fact that you have some interesting gardens here is purely synchronicity. But thank you very much both Ruben and Nilesh for inviting me. Can you hear me? A little bit up? Is that good? Sound? How about this? Better? Okay, excellent. I actually do teach classes with 500 students when I wear a mic. So my talk today really emerges from my recent book, which came out about 10 months ago in 2015 or so, A Place for Utopia, which seeks to harness the idea of utopia for examining counter-urbanisms, emergent urbanisms, or alternative constructions of the city in the last 100 years or so. And I seek to tie the South Asian historical experience with Europe and North America. So this particular chapter, this particular talk today is based on a chapter in the book, but I'm also interested in troubling imperial legacies to some extent, and I very much look forward to questions after my talk from all of you. My talk specifically is concerned with the Theosophical Society in its international headquarters in Adyar. This is in the South Indian city of Madras or Chennai, and the ways in which it provided a unique context for imagining garden design in cities. Theosophy, a novel example of religious transculturalism that bridged South Asia, Europe, and North America, has received detailed attention. On the one hand, its articulation of religion with ideas of race or gender, science, nation, bore a somewhat direct relationship to empire. We can note in passing that concepts of universal brotherhood or races and sub-races deployed by theosophists like Madame Blavatsky appropriated racial evolutionism, even while it was a reflection on the dominance of Christianity in the colonial project. On the other hand, Theosophists' foregrounding of spiritualist cosmologies inspired critiques of imperialism or produced anti-colonial manifestos, as was the case of Annie Besant, the socialist feminist turned theosophist. In my talk today, I reflect on a character much more self-effacing than Annie Besant, and certainly non-controversial, unlike Theosophy's other luminaries, such as Colonel Olcott, Blavatsky, Charles Leadbeater, or J. Krishnamurti, some of these figures you might know. This is the occluded figure of the Sri Lankan Theosophist and Society President, C. Jinarajadasa, 1875 to 1953. Theosophy and its central characters have been basically positioned within the imagining of the nation, secularity, and religion in the shared colonial experience of India and Britain. I look at theosophy, however, within an urban context rather than a national one. I also emphasize Jinarajadasa's invoking and grounding of spirits, spirited cosmologies, and spiritualist place designs in the modern city rather than the preoccupation with a lost place from a lost time. So, trying to know Raja. C. Jinarajadasa, known as Raja or Brother Raja, more than anyone else in the Theosophical Society, made a refuge for the ecological and utopian potential of theosophy in soil, trees, gardens, and locality that was never actually realized so clearly elsewhere. This homemaking, present in intellectual convictions and in practice, achieves particular force given the details of his transcultural journeys and homecomings to Theosophy and its headquarters in Adyar, Madras. A modest being, his uniqueness is generally hidden in normal histories and writings about the TS, or Theosophical Society. For example, a standard vision of his role appears in the 1935 Jubilee number, which has pages of photographs dedicated to the great leaders of the Theosophical Society. Amidst advertisements for toothpaste, a Laurel and Hardy film that's showing in the Roxy Theatre, there appears the following classification. Blavatsky and Leadbeater as occultists, Henry Olcott, Annie Besant and Arundale, George Arundale as presidents, and Jina Rajadasa and Rukmini Arundale as artists. Identifying Rukmini Arundale, dancer, spouse of George Arundale and a driving force behind the art center Kalakshetra, as an artist is not difficult. But the casual manner in which Jina Rajadasa is typified as an artist does not readily reveal how his love of art and beauty was anchored in a very sophisticated cosmological vision. Even the official histories of the TS present a simplified view amidst hundreds of pages dominated by Annie Besant, controversies connected with Leadbeater and Krishnamurti, and factional struggles within the society. They present a view of Jina Rajadasa as a dedicated servant of Theosophy, loyal in his friendships, an accomplished linguist and writer, having written over 40 books, and an untiring speaker on theosophical matters in venues across the globe, even during the First and Second World War. Although Jina Rajadasa is now separated by over half a century from us, one can't help but be drawn to this being who is described by close associates as displaying the same sweetness and quiet power in the midst of failing health as before, and continuing to give lectures as he had done for over 50 years all over the world, who would be remembered for his effortless method of speech, and above all, the rare combination of a very serious look with his continuous smile. He's also invoked as a feminist who recognized woman and man as, I quote, equally divine embodiments of the one life. And he referred to life with a capital L, which gives you a sense of the vitalist sense with which he approached that idea. Incidentally, in 1916, he married a feminist, an Irish feminist called Dorothy Graham, who founded the Women's Indian Association in 1917 with another Irish feminist and theosophist who is very well known in these circles, Margaret Cousins. A close reading of his work reveals the lucidity of his presentation of theosophy in the world. In Ritual of the Mystic Star, written in 1951, he argues that the divine manifests itself in the daily activities of mankind. As we shall see, it is this version of theosophy as embodied practice, that every action well done and every act of self-sacrifice releases more life, a calculus of what I'm going to call transmutation and sublimation that is grounded in place that makes Jina Rajadasa unique. The details of his life are as follows. He was born in 1875, the same date that Theosophy was formed. Theosophical Society was formed in Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, of Sinhalese Buddhist parents. The turning point in his life came at age 13 when he met Charles Leadbeater, who was in Ceylon assisting the Buddhist educational movement. Both the founders of Theosophy, Blavatsky and Olcott, had converted to Buddhism, but it was really Olcott's enthusiasm for creating an enduring link between Theosophy and Buddhism that several others, including Leadbeater, participated. One interpretation suggests that Leadbeater recognized Jina Rajadasa as a brother incarnated from a previous life in South America. Jina Rajadasa clearly believed that this interpretation and remained loyal to his brother till the end. In an early sketch for children written in 1908 called The Master, he describes the outcome of this encounter with Leadbeater, who spoke to him one evening on a walk in Ceylon about two incarnations, the glorious work of serving them, and the choices facing him. I quote, "He was only a boy, little flower, and I think he did not fully understand all that was said, but he listened quietly, And before he slept that night, he had chosen, end of quote. And there's tremendous pathos in what follows. I quote, soon there came the day when the karma of his choice required that the boy leave with his brother of a past life for far-off lands, there to begin his training for the work of the one he had chosen. Step by step, he moved as though each step was familiar to him, though in reality each was strange and utterly unlike any experience of his brief life. He broke from all that bound him to country and people and plunged into his unknown future, end of quote. Crying himself to sleep that night in a ship's cabin when it dawned on him that he was to be separated from a young friend who was the light of his life, Jina Rajadasa writes that he was later to leave his body and go with his brother, i.e. Leadbeater, to see the master, who blessed him, and with that began a new life. This was obviously a reference to some sort of astral travel that Theosophists believed in. One account suggests that Leadbeater had become very attached to Jina Rajadasa and persuaded himself that he must take charge of his education, and through an elaborate plot spirited him away from his parents and took him to England to begin a different life. In 1889, Jina Rajadasa accompanied Leadbeater to England, a journey to and a life there that most certainly included hardship and suffering, met Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant for the first time, and became a member of the Theosophical Society in 1893. After a private education, he went up to St. John's College, Cambridge in 1896 and obtained a degree in Oriental languages in 4 years. Obviously a very gifted scholar, a picture from him from this time remains with me. It depicts a rather small man dressed in a suit, a gentle yet serious expression in his eyes, cradling a street tabby that he called G, which is kind of a term of respect in South Asia. And he would take this tabby, this cat, with him to Cambridge. Convinced that she was evolving into a soul, Jina Rajadasa described her as a chum, and she remained with him for about 10 years, even traveling with him to Italy and Ceylon and other places. After a short stint in Ceylon, Jina Rajadasa returned to Europe to study literature and science at the University of Pavia in 1902. He became proficient in a number of other European languages, including Spanish and Portuguese, adding to the South Asian ones he already knew. By 1904, there's frequent mention of his proficiency as an international lecturer, and we see him in photographs during this period dressed either in a suit or in white Indian clothes. Later, when Annie Besant came to acquire guardianship of J. Krishnamurti, who became well known as a messiah in theosophical circles at that time, and took them to Europe, Jina Rajadasa became involved with plans for their education for several years. He was to speak fondly of Krishnamurti both before and after the latter's disbanding of the Order of the Star of the East in 1929 and his break with Theosophy. In the aftermath of Alcott's passing in 1907 and the assumption of leadership by Annie Besant, we witnessed the quiet rise of Jina Rajadasa in the Theosophical Society. In 1914, he gave all the annual convention lectures, and for the rest of his life was to give them in every annual meeting. He became vice president of the society from 1921 to 1928, president of the National Fellowship of Arts and Crafts from 1923 to 1907, and then finally president of the Theosophical Society after George Arundale's death in 1945. He had in fact refused to be considered president after Annie Besant's death in 1933. He was also the editor of the Theosophist several times in this time period. Amidst this list of achievements, we have glimpses of this man. His habit of reading encyclopedias, his enthusiasm for singing Waltzing Matilda, his occult effectiveness, his admiration for Maria Montessori, who had been staying at the Theosophical Society because she was, she was Italian during the Second World War, his Buddhist core, and the enormous challenge and strain of his work post-war and post-colony. In cameos of his person, he comes across as one who did not expect personal happiness, and sometimes feeling sorrow acutely. His poems describe a tired sentry waiting for walls to crumble and sunshine to live. Ever dutiful in spite of ill health, he arrived in the US for the American Convention when he passed away in 1953. His ashes were scattered in the Fox River near St. Charles, Illinois, and he had said that it was all the same to him as a monad if they were scattered into the sea, a river, or down a drain. Grounding Theosophy. If the Theosophical Society continues to bear a vital and material impact in Chennai city in South India, which is the site of its international headquarters, it is because of the existence of its gardens that probably comprise the second largest green space in the city after Guindy National Park. And this figure shows you what the park, the garden looked like around the year 1925. Shortly after arriving in India in 1879, the founders of the Theosophical Society purchased a small estate of 27 acres called Huddleston Gardens for the Society's headquarters in an area that was chiefly occupied by Europeans and some fishers. It appears from early photographs that this area was not as densely covered by shrubbery or brush or trees as it later came to be, and there were a few buildings. And in fact, Huddleston Gardens was the home of a European who had decided to live in Adyar. Much of the building work on the original estates happened under the inspiration of Colonel Olcott, who remained president for life from 1875 to 1907, Madame Blavatsky having departed from India earlier. Under Annie Besant, the next president, further expansion of the estate occurred. And by 1925, the estate comprised 262 acres, and it's about the same today. It is this estate that is home to the famous banyan tree, which, when it was acquired, the estate was acquired, was about 200 years old, and in its heyday covered about 40,000 square feet with a 40-foot trunk. And that was sort of the centerpiece of the Theosophical Society. The trunk was uprooted by a gale in about 1989. But it's home to this famous banyan tree, under which J. Krishnamurti gave several inspired talks, and where he opened services at the shrine called the Bharata Samaja in 1925. In a beautiful location in the Palm Grove, Jinaraja Dasa began construction of a Buddhist shrine near the Olcott Memorial, also in 1925. And this shrine is also specifically important because a sapling of the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha sat in Bodh Gaya was brought from India to this particular spot and planted there. So it harkens back to a much older period of thinking about groves and gardens, if you like, and green spaces. The theosophical conviction in the brotherhood of religions and its encouragement of the study of comparative religion, science, and philosophy also found a home not only in the rich collections of Adyar Library, but in this estate's design of religious shrines among green nature. A Sikh temple. This is a Zoroastrian shrine and a church. And there were other such places in this garden. After the estate was expanded, efforts were made to use part of the grounds for study and also for trees, plants, and flowers. It appears that over time, some areas were left deliberately wild and picturesque with unpaved paths, and some featured native and exotic trees and plants, like this one, in informal beds rather than informally designed areas. Here and there were positioned temple columns and seats, memorials, a Buddha image, and pools of water. This shows you Colonel Olcott, and here is a memorial shrine to Colonel Olcott, actually. Separate areas were given over to horticultural experiments, such as the cultivation of a native variety. I found this particularly fascinating, although I wasn't able to find in more details about this. The cultivation of a native variety of spineless cactus as cattle fodder an orangery with Australian oranges, as well as attempts to grow coconuts and other fruits and vegetables for financial returns to the society. It is not widely known outside the Theosophical Society the large role that Jina Rajadasa played in the renaturing of Adyar Gardens over several decades, so that today it is home not only to a vast number of trees and plants, but also migratory birds like the pink flamingo and other fauna. So you have jackals and mongooses and so on if you take a walk in this garden. He receives mention usually for the fact that in the Silver Jubilee year of the Theosophical Society, he planted mahogany seedlings to form an avenue running through the center of the estate. Soil from a number of countries were put into pits prepared for the seedlings, so that today if you walk through this avenue, it's called Founders Avenue, you still read the names on the plaques. Ukraine, Brazil, Puerto Rico, and so on. And this is where the soil from different countries came for the trees that were to be planted, the mahogany trees. Long before he became president, Jina Rajadasa supervised the vast acreage of Adyar. In a reversal of European journeying to the tropics and the south for the collection of flora and fauna, but in concert with the expansion of a global network of botanical gardens in the colonies, he brought to Adyar about 300 species of seeds and plants from various countries. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. What was going on? What was this exploration about? After the Second World War, much had to be done to restore the estate because the Royal Air Force had occupied a part of it and overcome the neglect that the garden had suffered. Mr. Kurpad, who had been agricultural advisor to the Nizam of Hyderabad, a neighboring ruler, was put in charge of the gardens. Jina Rajadasa knew the landscape intimately. Suffering from insomnia, he would take long walks across the bridge, down to the river and near the beach, back again past the Leadbeater Chambers and the Palm Grove, sending thought waves to purify the atmosphere, because for him Adyar was the home of the masters. Since the beginning of the estate, trees were not allowed to be felled or tended too much except for those grown for fuel, and flowers were not plucked indiscriminately. Jina Rajadasa himself would not accept garlands. So what was the model of garden design here? In my book, I argue that the design of the Theosophical Society gardens was a complex refashioning of three norms. First, there's what I'm going to call the South Indian Victorian, which drew on European 19th century ideas of wild and pastoral visions of Arcadia, along with South Indian designs for gardens, horticultural gardens, which are known by different terms in the vernacular, and the scrub jungle that is typical of this area. So the South Indian Victorian, sort of displaced into this landscape. Second, I think there's what I call the greening of the idea of comparative religions. And so the study and practice of comparative religions with religious shrines from several world traditions, but set amidst green nature. And third, the idea of an urban green that is bound up with the idea of a Buddhist forest fraternity. And this was the idea that I think Jina Raja draws upon quite strongly, where he thinks of a forest fraternity of living beings, of organisms that are evolving into sentient beings. And so the Buddhist Sangha really involved a wider community. So three norms as I see it in the Adyar Gardens. This is actually an early representation of the Buddha, a very typical representation of the Buddha from iconography that goes back a long way, where he's usually shown, he's sometimes shown with just his feet, but also typically a tree, representing also the Bodhi tree under which he attained enlightenment. So I call this section Meeting One's Flower. you could call it meeting one's tree, I suppose. But, the grounding of Theosophy in place, the ecological utopian vision combining the South Indian Victorian garden, comparative religions, and the Sangha, the community of the faithful, if you like, and human and non-human nature, is movingly articulated by Jina Rajadasa in his writings. He was a prolific writer, and although at first it appears that he pursued a number of disparate themes in his writing, the structure of his vision becomes very clear if you ask, why does Jina Rajadasa address so many of his books, they're all still widely circulating in the Theosophical Society, why does he address so many of his books to children? Sometimes the child invoked is Little Flower. Sometimes the narration is about the divine child in different books that he writes. One reading is that it's possible to trace a path from Jina Rajadasa's own loss of childhood or own loss in childhood to the modern preoccupation with children from Maria Montessori to Wordsworth, and they're both people that he cites in his writings. But I posit a slightly different sort of reading, which is in two parts, and I'll go slowly. First, Jina Rajadasa connects the place of children within Utopia with the place of nature and gardens. So children in Utopia with nature and gardens. And second, this spatial dimension is linked to a temporal one that projects a path from the master or the masters and the Buddha to the future. So there's a spatial dimension and there's a temporal dimension, I think, in Jina Rajadasa's vision that come together. One that links the place of children with the place of nature, or Utopia with nature. And second, one that connects a path from the past to the future through the figure of the Buddha, among others. In the first instance, this connection between children and gardens and utopias and gardens is made through a calculus of reincarnation. In the second instance, the temporal dimension, it's made through a calculus of renunciation. So reincarnation and renunciation. And I'll see if I can explain this a little as we go on. So he wrote a number of fables about children, but the one that I think is it's in a piece called Chatta and the Buddha, which was written around 1908, elucidates several features of Jina Rajadasa's vision, apart from the fact that it is a story of a boy about the same age as Jina Rajadasa when he left Ceylon or Sri Lanka. The outline of the story is as follows. In a town near Banaras in North India lived a boy called Chatta, who was about 13 years old. He was a good boy, fond of his studies, and lived with a teacher whom he served while he was studying in a typical fashion of that time. One day, on his way home through Banaras, with a gift for his teacher, he happened to hear Samana Gautama, then 45 years old, speak in the city. People called Samana Gautama Buddha, and those who had met him were struck with awe by the beauty of his face and his loving eyes. The Buddha had special powers. He could see the past, the present, and the future, and also that which was far away. This is kind of typical of the Buddha in many writings. He saw that it was Chatta's karma to die soon at the hands of robbers, and so resolved to help him meet death thinking noble thoughts. So the Buddha called Chatta to him after the sermon and made him repeat what has come to be known as the 5 precepts. Then he asked, Chatta, someday would you like to be as I am now, a teacher and a guide to men? Someday in the future will you be a Buddha as I am one today? Chatta agreed, and Samana Gautama gave him a song to sing with several verses, including the fact that it was a good thing to help all live beautiful lives and to be a Buddha one day. Having been chosen by the Buddha for his accumulation of good karma, Chatta went the next day singing his song joyfully. It was as the Buddha foresaw, but Chatta was not frightened when death came. The robbers killed his body, but he was not killed, and he was just the same as in his astral body, and soon he was in heaven where Gautama taught him new truths. Chatta was reborn some years later in Athens, and then dying at the age of 27 was again reincarnated in India. So this is a little fable that was actually a fable for children, but could be read by others, that Jinaraja Dasa wrote way back in 1908. So what does the fable tell us? It's the possibility of having a dual nature, of living in several worlds and lives through the calculus of reincarnation that makes Jinaraja Dasa write, God's plan is evolution. By this, he means that life is everywhere, there's no dead substance, and that the life of the plant, the animal, or man is not different from the stone. So corollaries to this obviously are that life with a capital L never dies, death is only a change of form, and that life evolves. So Chatta one day may be a Buddha through the work of several lives, but nature also involves the flow of life through its various forms. So he writes somewhere, reincarnation is a fact in nature. And nature, thus imagined, is not mechanical but ethical. This is the point. This is the view coming from Jinaraja Dasa that allows us a perspective on the gardens that he was extremely influential in creating. So nature is not mechanical, it is ethical. Reincarnation is a fact in nature. And the life of plant, animal, man, or stone is not very different from each other. So he writes that one can sense the rhythm of life through the worship of nature, its study, or by refashioning it, for example, in art. The parallelism and the interrelationship between the child and nature is made most clearly in the vision of a dream place in Jinaraja Dasa's book called Flowers and Gardens. It's an eco-utopia where society exists for the welfare of children, and children have a special bond with the aged in this particular vision. Inspired, it is said, by a French garden, Jinaraja Dasa writes of the religion of this dream community. They think of each individual as having a flower within him which is slowly opening. They speak of the flower in man, of man dying and meeting his flower, and the flower of flowers. The flowers in nature are seen as mirrors of virtue calling upon people's flowers to open. And people surround themselves with flowers, and in the garden, children are gardeners whose directions are followed. So this is a vision of utopia as a garden community, and it's matched with the association of childhood with flowers. And we could say a lot about how this contrasts, if you like, with imperial designs for gardens in other places. I will not pursue here the terrain shared by Jinaraja Dasa with other theosophists, which include ideas of masters and the Great White Brotherhood and so forth. He dedicates several of his writings to a master called Kuthumi. But if Kuthumi was his personal guru through his coming to Theosophy, his writings and interpretations of release make clear that the Buddha is also centrally a master for him. Just as Victorian and European gardens, or Maria Montessori's vision of the nurture required in childhood so that the soul of the child may flower, offer a mirror to Jinaraja Dasa's imagination. And we can think about other figures during this in South Asia for whom the child also was very central. Rabindranath Tagore, for instance, is one of them. So there are parallels to be drawn between European gardens, Maria Montessori, that offer this kind of mirror for Jinaraja Dasa's imagination. But I think the Buddha also occupies a singular valence during this historical conjuncture. Jinaraja Dasa's life coincides with Dr. Ambedkar, that some of you might know, who was a great Dalit leader, a great leader of untouchables in South Asia, who publicly converted to Buddhism in 1956 with about 400,000 followers. And this was perhaps the most significant event in Buddhism in about 1,000 years in South Asia. And Ambedkar died a few months actually after this public conversion, creating the big turning of the wheel of Buddhism in South Asia. So, although Jina Rajadasa does not mention Ambedkar, I think it's important to realize that many of these figures are part of a conversation about the place of Buddhism in South Asia at this time period. From Jina Rajadasa's Sinhalese Buddhist milieu and a genealogy that links Theosophy to Buddhism via Colonel Olcott, the American Protestant white Buddhist, and then there were others such as Anagarika Dharmapala, we have to sort of decipher the critical value of Buddhism at this time. Jina Rajadasa's 1908 sketch, Christ and the Buddha, outlines the chain that links Buddha in past lives to the present. It tells of the noble man Sumedha at the time of the Buddha Dipankara, who through an act of self-sacrifice would later in life become Gautama Buddha. Life after life he toiled and escalated his evolution through renunciation so that he was born Gautama Buddha to guide humanity. The story, the fable, this is another fable, that Jina Rajadasa writes, goes on to create an imaginative genealogy that links the Buddha through Christ to the Theosophical Society, which is not very convincing. However, the practices that allow the movement from the past to the present is interesting. Jina Rajadasa shows in this little book and elsewhere that the movement is through a calculus of renunciation. Self-sacrifice, he writes, is the law of evolution for men. The way for the fulfillment of life is to bear the burden of others. So a very sort of Buddhist and perhaps even Christian sort of rendering of the tale. In Jina Rajadasa's writings, we see the entire terrain of what I call spiritualist place design that grounds Theosophy in the Adyar Gardens in the early 20th century, and this involves correspondences, transmutations, mediations, and the value placed on life, gardens, and nature. Now, there were other spiritualist traditions that emerged out of a colonial context in South Asia that also anchored ecological utopias. Auroville in Pondicherry comes to mind. But I'm going to instead offer some reflections on Jina Rajadasa's design for place in Adyar. First, his efforts focus on the singularity of Adyar as a home for the masters and contrast paradoxically with his nomadic life and transcultural imagination. So he continued to come home to Adyar and Theosophy, although Adyar was really a home away from home for Jina Rajadasa and for many others such as Maria Montessori, who lived there for many years. Second, this nomadism links him with a community of seekers at the height of imperialism and in the modern period, who wandered in exile, displacement, or in transcultural interstices, and engaged in various practices of living in other places that complicated race, sexuality, or religion. These included figures such as the Mother and Aurobindo in Pondicherry, Aldous Huxley, Isherwood, and Swami Prabhavananda in the Vedanta Society in California that I've written about, as well as those who journeyed in Raja's Ceylon, such as the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. So I think what I'm trying to sort of gesture towards is that Jina Rajadasa is part of some kind of transcultural process that is happening within the cracks, if you like, or within the legacies of empire that presents some interesting correspondences that we can think about. Third, as we should see, Adyar itself in Jina Raja's time was the spatial frontier of a city that was expanding. It was still set apart from the city, as groves often are in Buddhist texts, and was a ground for exploring the relationship between human and non-human nature and for cultural futures, for other possibilities during empire. This, however, was to fade away in the post-colonial city. So eclipse and reclamation. How much time do you have? 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Jina Rajadasa represents the apex of the coming together of Buddhism and Theosophy in South Asia in the mid-20th century. From Olcott's central efforts for the revival of Buddhism in Ceylon from 1880 onwards, the tracks between Theosophy and Buddhism crisscrossed in several personal and institutional histories. These included the role of the founder of the Mahabodhi Society, Anagarika Dharmapala, who was inspired by Olcott and Blavatsky and maintained close relations with the society for many years, as well as other individuals such as Sir Edwin Arnold and Christmas Humphreys, who are deeply influential in translating Buddhism for an Anglophone world. Olcott died in 1907, Dharmapala in 1933, and Jina Rajadasa in 1953. While it provided a counterpoint to Dharmapala's more nationalist Buddhist project, and a contrast to leaders such as Ambedkar, who had also turned to a Buddhist past for understanding untouchable and Dalit history and identity, with Jina Rajadasa's death, a gentler and more thoughtful strain of Theosophical Buddhism or Buddhist Theosophy at the Adyar quarter seems to have been eclipsed by nation-state formation or civilizational projects in Asia. And you can see this in many ways, including in the leadership that succeeded Jina Rajadasa and in other things, such as the Adyar Library Bulletin, which basically shows a general decline in writings on Buddhism from this time period onwards. There was really no renewing of contacts between Buddhism and Theosophy till the 1980s or 1990s, once Jina Rajadasa passes away. And this time it includes not just the Mahabodhi Society, but also the Dalai Lama and the Vietnamese Buddhist Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who both now in exile due to the sort of shadows cast by militarism in their separate countries. These shifts in the Theosophical Society after the 1950s parallel the spatial realignments of Adyar in the post-colonial city. And so I'm just going to gesture to this a little bit and we can come back and talk about this in the Q&A. Up till 1946, Adyar and the area, the river Adyar and the area bearing its name remained the southern limit of the city called Madras. So I'll just say a few words about Madras itself. The city was founded as a fort settlement by the British who took it over from a native ruler, bunch of fishing villages, kind of the story of Bombay to some extent, and renamed Fort St. George. It continued to grow towards the north. The southern areas remain fairly separate, and this is where Adyar is located. So till the 1940s, Adyar was really an exurb of the city itself, with some Europeans, but basically fisher folk. By about the mid-century, mid-20th century, Adyar becomes an area for middle-class suburbs in post-independence Madras. And by about 1990, it develops into a new industrial corridor in the south side of the city. So about the time that Jina Rajadasa passes away, and with the realignment sort of ideologically within the Theosophical Society, the post-colonial city is also changing, and with it the place of the Theosophical Society in that larger metropolis. Today, from the 1990s onwards, Adyar has become the leisure hub of the IT strata who use the ocean front and its hinterland as a place of leisure and consumption. There are still pockets of alternative visions within Adyar. There is the school, it's called the school, inspired by J. Krishnamurti. There's also the art and dance center called the Kalakshetra, which connect to older experiments in spirituality and education and in art. But the ecological vision and the spiritualist place design of the TS Gardens has now been absorbed into the idea of a heritage site. So it's not the vibrant garden that it was in earlier years. It's basically regarded as one of the few original places in the post-colonial city where you can meet, where nature is as it was, where one can engage in, sort of encountering wild nature, etc. Although in fact this was largely a 20th century creation, and it happened within a relatively short period. Other places within the Theosophical Society attract very few people on a daily basis, and even its famed library bears a desultory look. The post-1990s green placemaking in Madras or Chennai includes the neighboring Adyar Eco Park, which was opened by the Tamil Nadu government, where Madras is, in 2011. And Adyar Eco Park is meant to showcase and restore the ecosystem of this area. It's an ecotourism and education area. So these heritage projects, including the Theosophical Society today, have much in common with other public memory projects in the city of Madras, as in many other places, which are critically linked to urban restructuring that's been going on since the 1990s with a kind of neoliberal reclamation of the city's past, whether it's nature or the ecosystem, or public memorials for the dead chief minister, or other such places. So the fading away of Jina Rajadasa's sense of place in the post-colonial city is linked to Adyar ceasing to be a spatial frontier and becoming a point of entry into new suburban cultures of the self in Chennai. So I'm going to just stop here and open this up for discussion, but basically I think what fascinated me in the case of this garden, and we can even ask ourselves if garden is the right term for this space. But basically this renaturing of Adyar was the fact that it poses questions to other kinds of legacies of green spaces in South Asia, whether it is the green space that separates the cantonment from the old city that we find in many parts of South Asia, or it's the idea of the civic park, which is meant to be a place for women and laboring classes and others to sort of engage in healthy pursuits. So each of these things seems to be interrogated by this kind of park. So I find it a very interesting experiment in not only thinking about the past, but also the relevance of the past in the present with an idea, with an idea of cultural futures that we see in the Theosophical Society at this moment. Thank you.